Hello, this is Jackie, and today's lecture is going to be on a culture of innovativeness in high-tech companies. This is a continuation of our high-tech marketing slide deck number 2 on strategy and culture. And I'll go ahead and set up my screen share here so that we can dive right in. So you might remember that in class this past Thursday, we did our application of Apple and Google and Amazon, and we'll be doing Airbnb at the start of class on Tuesday. If you missed that lecture, why don't you go ahead and Slack me your core competency analysis, a tree diagram for one of the companies of your choice. This module now will focus on organizational culture. The definition of organizational culture is the company's shared values and beliefs about the things that they value. And this sets standards for how people act and the priorities by which decisions are made. Corporate culture is very tacit, and it's based around observing how people behave, their routines, and their storytelling about what matters. So for example, in the business school, our organizational culture is very much student-focused and student-friendly, and faculty are encouraged both explicitly and implicitly to always ensure that they're putting students' career success at the top of the priority, which I think we do a reasonably good job of from my vantage point, and I'm always curious to hear students' perceptions about that. We're going to be applying organizational culture now to high-tech companies specifically. And the aspect of culture that we'll be focusing on is what's known as a culture of innovation or a culture of innovativeness. And I just want you to think for a minute before I dive into the material. One might expect that the answer to the question, do high-tech companies exhibit a culture of innovativeness, to be yes, because after all, they're high-tech companies and they're known for always staying on the cutting edge of what's important. However, if you think carefully about the trajectory of the kind of birth and death of high-tech companies over the years, what you'll see is that many high-tech companies do not succeed and thrive on an ongoing basis, particularly as new technological trajectories take over old technologies or incumbent technologies. So let's review for a minute from our first module the notion of competitive volatility. When we discussed competitive volatility, we talked about this idea that companies need to constantly be working to jump to the next technology life cycle. And what this requires that they do is make their current generation of technology obsolete by proactively developing next generation technology. So let's think of some examples of this. A classic example is Kodak, and Kodak was not willing to move into digital film because it would cannibalize their legacy revenue model that came from their film developing business. Similarly, I've used the example of Sony, who was so famous for their Walkmans and their Discmans. Why didn't they move into MP3 players? And again, the issue was they were not willing to obsolete the current generation of technology. So this phrase that is used by Clayton Christensen from the Harvard Business School to capture this conundrum is called the innovator's dilemma, where the innovator refers to a company and their dilemma is captured in these first two bullets. Do I make my current technology obsolete by proactively developing next generation technology, or do I continue to focus on my current source of revenue from my current technology? And this decision is fundamental because most companies are unwilling to demonstrate the courage that it takes to cannibalize their existing revenue stream. So I've also used the example in class of Barnes & Noble, who was unwilling to sell books online, and as a result, they were Amazoned. So high-tech companies, in fact, all companies face this dilemma. And the dilemma exists because companies have sunk costs in their existing technology. There's also a bias in managerial decision-making towards the known and familiar versus the uncertain and risky of new technologies. Current customers also tend to want to stick with the known and familiar. Think about the FUD factor that we've talked about. And certainly companies have difficulty innovating and responding to disruption. The fact is, in order to cannibalize their legacy technology, companies need to divert resources from pursuing incremental innovations to new markets and customers that may not only seem insignificant, but that are unknown and uncertain. The answer to the innovator's dilemma is called creative destruction. So this is the idea of you don't want to be Amazoned. So I put here in my own words, be the Amazoner, not the Amazonee. And this requires that companies unlearn their traditional focus on traditional technology that's known, and those traditional routines and processes may in fact inhibit the ability to move into new technologies, such as the Kodak example, such as the Barnes & Noble example. And in order to engage in creative destruction, a company has to develop and facilitate this culture of innovativeness. So let's define this culture in the next slide. A culture of innovativeness is characterized by breakthrough thinking that challenges the status quo. A culture of innovativeness uses new sources of ideas for innovation in order to escape the tyranny of the served market, where the tyranny of the served market is always responding to existing customers' known needs. If you go back to your dimensions of incremental versus breakthrough innovation, you will find that incremental innovations are characterized by customers' ability to articulate what new features and benefits they want. Customers can say, I want faster cars, safer cars, more fuel-efficient cars, but customers are not likely to say, I want a flying car, or I want a jetpack. So the idea of a culture of innovativeness is to get in front of customers and lead customers to the innovation, because sometimes they don't even know what's possible. We see this with Tesla. We see this with, let me think of another example, Apple. And the way that companies can actually measure whether they have a culture of innovativeness is to assess the percentage of their sales revenue that's derived from new innovations that are breakthrough innovations. Another way to measure what the culture of innovativeness is to look at the new innovations in your industry and see how many of those innovations were developed by your competitors or by new startups in the industry. And if most of the new breakthrough innovations are coming from other companies, clearly your organization lacks a culture of innovativeness. Now, it is very difficult to develop a culture of innovativeness. And in addition to the innovator's dilemma, a company's core competencies can paradoxically simultaneously be core rigidities. where the things that we are really good at, our well-established routines, actually prevent us from taking a fresh perspective. They create blinders for us that make it hard to see new things. And you'll see that in high-tech companies in particular, the status hierarchies that give preference to R&D personnel over marketing personnel can be a source of these core rigidities. I've already mentioned the preference for known and familiar technologies and products, and the focus on existing technologies and products rather than thinking about customers' unmet needs. And the fact is, these core rigidities inhibit a company's ability to develop unfamiliar skills, routines, and knowledge. In fact, universities are really struggling with this right now, where our good capabilities and face-to-face instruction are inhibiting us from really thinking creatively about reimagining the future of education. And the big trend in business right now is what's called the future of work. How do employees need to be retrained and reskilled to take advantage of new working environments and technologies in the future? So what I'd like you to know from this material is not only what is a culture of innovativeness, I'd like you to be able to articulate the innovator's dilemma and why it's so hard for even high-tech companies to be innovative. And then from this list of 7 facilitators of innovativeness, I'd like you to understand how these can be used to help companies develop this important cultural trait of being innovative. The first one I'll start with on this list is top management support. The fact is, organizational culture starts at the top, and many studies of cultures of innovativeness show that organizations like Apple, Amazon, Google, the signals that top managers send about their willingness to embrace new technologies, breakthrough innovations, thinking about solving customer needs in new ways that are very disruptive is critical. And if top managers are not willing to signal that they're willing to tolerate risk, which comes with a certain amount of failure, then it's very difficult for a company to be innovative. Risk tolerance is a very important trait of a culture of innovativeness. So the next slide talks about some of the aspects of risk tolerance that are critically important. Rather than penalizing employees for innovation ideas that do not work out, it's really important to view attempts at innovation as learning opportunities. And so it's pretty common in the technology industry to talk about fail fast, which means how quickly can you get market data that gives you input on whether your idea is viable. And the quicker you can get that data, it allows you to learn from failure. And the fact is, what you thought was a mistake may prove to be the next thing. And it's really important that the internal compensation system not penalize employees for mistakes and to actually reward risk-taking. So one of my former students, Chris Wright, is a product marketing manager at Google, and he tells a story from his early years at Google where he just thought he was crushing it in his new job because everything he did was succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. And lo and behold, at Google, one of the metrics for success is how many failures have you had? And the paradoxical idea is that if all the things you're working on are successful, you must not be breaking the rules and trying new things, because if you're really trying new things that are risky, they shouldn't all work out. So all of a sudden, Chris had to do kind of this head shift and say, oh, I need to really be putting my ideas in a more forward-looking, kind of aggressive, risky space so that Google can continue to have this culture of innovation. And as I've mentioned, the physical environment at Google that you see here is designed to really facilitate thinking in a different way. Another characteristic of innovativeness is what's known as an agile or a lean startup mindset. The word agile does come from software development, and it is a particular approach to dividing projects in software development so that they're broken into small, manageable components that you can figure out if they're viable quickly. There's a very famous book called The Lean Startup that also talks about how you can test your ideas quickly to get market feedback before you invest in prototyping and very many fixed costs of app development to really figure out if it makes sense. I call this mindset enlightened experimentation, where every idea you have should be viewed as a hypothesis, and your job is to figure out how to quickly get data to test that hypothesis. And for those of you who are sports fans, a really nice sports metaphor is this would be winning a game based at times at bat rather than trying to always swing for the home run. Some of the language associated with this agile mindset as a culture of innovation is thinking about product and innovation in terms of a minimum viable product, sometimes known as an MVP. What is the minimum feature set that you need to test your idea to get this accurate learning about whether customers find that it meets their needs? And based on that minimum viable product, the engineer can quickly recalibrate the feature set in terms of delivering a market offering. So for those of you who are into mountaineering and rock climbing, ice climbing, this might be a light and fast type of expedition. And the implication here is that by learning about the market through this enlightened experimentation, you're more likely to be successful, you're more likely to be innovative, and you can quickly adapt your market offerings. A fourth key attribute of facilitators of innovativeness, remember we've done top management, we've done the risk tolerance, and we've done the agile mindset. So number 4 here is skunkworks. A skunkworks is a particular type of new venture group in an established company that has been given permission to work outside the normal organizational hierarchy, processes, and routines. So it frees this new venture group from having to worry about, am I going to cannibalize an existing revenue source? Skunkworks are very common. This phrase was developed by Lockheed Martin in the aerospace industry, and it was when they were trying to figure out how to bring new products to market that didn't require such a high fixed cost overhead. IBM had a skunkworks when it developed the IBM PC in the mid-1990s. Merrill Lynch had a skunkworks when it decided that they were going to start offering stocks online as opposed to through a fully commissioned sales force. And in fact, the University of Montana has its own little skunkworks going right now with an initiative called Powered by which is a series of training courses offered to the business community by faculty that falls outside the normal 4-year enrolled college student for a degree. Now, the benefits of these skunkworks are that they do provide this very creative opportunity. And in fact, skunkworks are usually physically from the corporate environment as well. The Target Corporation, headquartered in Minneapolis, has a skunkworks in Silicon Valley because they know that retail has to compete with online e-commerce, and they wanted to locate their skunkworks in a place that is just steeped in technological thinking. So skunkworks can bring more creativity, and it's outside these existing corporate bureaucracy. However, data show that if the only way your company can be innovative is to isolate the innovation function outside the normal hierarchy, then it's really a very strong indictment that your company doesn't have a culture of innovativeness. So paradoxically, a skunk works can develop innovation, but to the extent that that creative process is isolated from the main company, it really doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And many companies struggle with how to integrate the skunk works projects then back into the corporate hierarchy once the innovation is developed. Another facilitator of innovation is the role of a product champion. A product champion is oftentimes considered to be an individual who goes rogue. And these people are willing to take on significant risks to see their innovation ideas succeed. They are tireless in crusading for their idea. And these people oftentimes are very happy breaking rules, they take risks, they're very savvy about the political environment internally. They have technical skills that allow them to understand the technical challenges of the innovation. And they're aggressive in the sense that they just work tirelessly for their idea. Now, the studies on product champions show that their role in highly innovative companies is one that is very much rewarded. So product champions in innovative firms actually have power, they get rewards, and top management support them. But product champions in less innovative firms, they actually end up becoming frustrated and demoralized and ultimately leave the company. So I'll give a quick example here. One of our former alum from the University of Montana is Bill McGlynn. He was the head vice president of HP's Boise division for the laser printer. And when he saw a new technology for laser printing called MEMS, Microelectronic Mechanical Systems, MEMJet was the name of the company, he realized that it had the potential to totally disrupt HP's LaserJet business. So he worked very hard to try to allow HP to invest in this new MEMS technology. And ultimately, HP was reluctant to do so because it would cannibalize their multifunction $1,000 printers. And Bill McGlynn ended up leaving HP to start a new printer company called MEMJet Technologies. You can look it up, but this is an example of losing a product champion because they became frustrated and demoralized. Now, there are many other facilitators of innovativeness. One of the big reasons we're pushing for diversity in high-tech companies, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, is because diverse teams actually have been shown to come up with more creative ideas. Companies that have close relationships with innovative customers tend to be more innovative themselves. Companies that invest in employee education about emerging technologies tend to be able to incorporate those emerging technologies like blockchain, artificial intelligence, into their technology roadmaps. Companies that have good communication are more innovative. And as I mentioned with Google, companies that build innovation into the performance review process tend to do better. Besides having a culture of innovativeness, there are other aspects of organizational culture that I'm not going to be focusing on in this lecture, but I would like you to know that tech companies can also be characterized by an engineering or product-driven culture. They can be competitor-oriented, or they can be customer/market-oriented. And each of these is a little bit different than what I've talked about with the focus on culture of innovativeness. So I just wanted you to know that these exist. I will be writing an exam question for you around the culture of innovation, so I hope you've taken good notes on this lecture. Thank you, and I'll see you Tuesday.